Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today to chat with everybody. I'm going to start off this session by taking us through what the objectives for today's sessions is today. So hopefully what we can do first is ground and a shared understanding of what is educational equity and how do each of us have like very unique individual entry points into understanding educational equity. And then using that shared understanding and collective wisdom to really consider how we can support emergent bilinguals in their language development and also in accessing academic rigorous content. And then we're going to be using those foundations to just give a little bit of updates about the language use survey and ELPA screening and assessment for the 2021 school year. We are going to be having a lot of conversation, a lot of content, and we might not have a lot of time to answer questions as we're going through this information. So on the last slide, you're going to see our contact information. And if you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to put them in the chat box, and also feel free to shoot us each an email depending on what your question is. And I just want to kind of give a caveat that even if we don't get to your question here in the session, we will be reaching out and looping back around with your information and guidance that we can provide. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. All right, so I want to start here in helping us really start to get that shared understanding. Before we go ahead and make a little bit of an anticipatory set considering what is educational equity, I want to say that the concept of anti-racism is not a political issue, it's a humanitarian issue. And so we really need to approach all of our work from a place of shared liberation. So in order to do that, we have to understand how our social identities, the ones that we hold, provide us with a very unique perspective and a very unique entry point into the conversation of educational equity and into the conversation of anti-racism. So what equity means to me is going to be very different than what it means to each of you, and rightfully so, because the way that I move through the world and the social identities that I hold that shape the way that I move through the world is what's going to inform my understandings of educational equity. So I want to kind of use the concept of intersectional identity as a springboard or a jump off point into this next activity. So using your social identities, using your perspective and your lenses and the way that you move through the world, I want you to grab a little piece of paper, or you can do this on your computer if that would work better for you. And I want you to put the word equity. I want you to put a circle around it, and then put some little spokes to that circle and put some little bubbles around it, and put some words that you think of when you think of the word equity. These are some of the words that come up. I'm going to give everyone about 10 or 15 seconds to jot down just a couple of words, and then I'm going to look at this wonderful list of names that I have in front of me of participants, and I'm going to select one person, and they're going to give us one of the words that they wrote down, and then I'm going to ask for Susie to select a person, and I'm going to ask for Ben to select a person as well. So hopefully we'll hear from 3 people. So just a little popcorn share out of what comes up for you when you think of the word equity. I'm going to do about 10 seconds of wait time, and then I'll select a person. Okay. So in looking at this list, I'm picking the person who has put in the queen. So whoever is the queen, I feel like you might have been asking to be voluntold by putting that name into this participant list. I'm just kidding about that last part. But whoever's listed here as the queen, please share with us what comes up for you when you think of the word equity. It's okay. It's okay if you didn't change your name. You can put it in the chat box too, if that would be better. So any one word, just go ahead and popcorn share out. Respect. Okay. The opportunity to help everyone have their voice heard. So opportunity, absolutely. All right. Susie, your turn. And everyone else, feel free to go ahead and type into the chat box. But Susie, you can pick someone to kind of put in the spotlight. What comes up for you when you think of equity?
Absolutely. I see Raquel, if you're there. Raquel Gwynn.
Hi there.
Hey, if you wanted to say what comes up for you.
Okay, I wasn't prepared for this, but what comes up for me when I think about educational equity, I think about access and opportunity, and that fair isn't always equal. So that idea of equality and equity, that comes up and comes to the forefront. And also, the stories in which we bring to the table and knowing the student who is in front of you.
Yes.
So just, off the top of my head, guys.
That's beautiful.
Yes.
That's beautiful, Raquel. Thank you. Thank you.
And that is also a great segue. I also want to say Ben selected Stephanie, and Stephanie put in the chat box. So awesome. Thank you so much. Respect is absolutely. So let's go to the next slide, because I feel like something that Raquel said right now, I promise I did not connect with Raquel Susie before this to give her a prompt on what to say. But she did actually say this, right? So that shift from equality to equity, right? That's what we like to call the base shift. It's one of the foundational concepts that we really need to internalize in order to operationalize educational equity in our individual practice, right? We have to make that shift from understanding that equity does not mean everyone gets the same. It means everyone gets what they need in order to succeed. And furthermore, the success might look different, right, depending on the way that I am defining it for myself, for my child. So these images that you see on the slide are probably images that you have seen some kind of version of in some kind of training at some point in the past 5 years, because they are pretty highly reproduced at this point. But I want to take your thinking a step further. I'm kind of banking on the fact that you have probably seen some iteration of these illustrations at this point, and so I want you to consider for a moment, if there was an additional box, right? So any one of these pictures that you're looking at, if there was a third box, what would that third box look like? And then once you have that third box in your head, what would that fourth box look like? Commit to the idea. I know, Ben, I know. Commit to the idea that there is no end game. Whatever end game we land on will be improved. It will have its areas of weakness. And that's okay. So I'm going to give you a minute to just consider that for a second. What is the third box? What is the fourth box? I can't get too far into it. I would love to hear from y'all, like what would look like but because for the sake of time, I have to say that some of the ideas that I have heard, if we're using the baseball analogy, is I've heard participants say, why is there a fence? Why don't they have seats? Who didn't give these kids tickets? Who has them sneaking into the games and looking over the fence? Someone give these kids some tickets. Other people said, well, what if they don't even like baseball? What if they like a different sport? Why can't they play the game? Why do they have to just be spectators? So I know that these metaphors can go in a lot of different ways, but I just what I would want to come from this conversation, if we had more time, is liberation from oppression, particularly from our educational systems, is going to look different for different kiddos. It does look different for different kiddos. And we have to give ourselves and our students the time, the space, the capacity to dream, so that they can create that vision, so that we can create that vision together. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is our ODE equity stance. I'm going to read it to you. It is a dense few sentences. And as I read these few sentences to you, I want you to consider how your intersectional identity, how your professional identity provides you an entry point to these three sentences. And what is your entry point? So here are the three sentences. Education equity is the equitable implementation of policy, practices, procedures, and legislation that translate into resource allocation, education rigor, and opportunities for historically and currently marginalized youth, students, and families, including civil rights protected classes. This means the restructuring and dismantling of systems and institutions that create the dichotomy of beneficiary and oppressed and marginalized. So again, I'm going to stop talking for a couple minutes and I want you to consider what's your entry point here? And how do your identities and your professional role influence that entry point? Let's go to the next slide, please. So when we say educational equity, the word equity, this is what we mean. This chart comes from Zaretta Hammond. She wrote this wonderful book called Culturally Responsive Teaching for the Brain. Highly recommended, 10/10, highly recommend. And this is how she defines equity. She defines it as having dimensions. And I've used this resource in trainings and different occasions, and had this wonderful conversation with a colleague one day where we were kind of going back and forth on, are these dimensions kind of like a pyramid, right? That there's you know, a side and all of them are equally as valuable? Or is it more like a spectrum where you're starting at multicultural education, right? Like that surface level, celebrating diversity, making sure that like our authors are diverse in our library, making sure we have posters in our school that represent the kids that we teach and all kids around the world, right? You know, exposing privileged kids to the way that other people live in our community that might not be as privileged, that surface level, right? Moving from that to that social justice education, to understanding the social political context that we're living in, that we're learning in right now, to raising our kids' consciousness about the inequities and the ways that they can become politicized and become more active in dismantling oppression, giving them the tools to recognize the patterns that exist, that have existed, right? And then eventually getting to that last stage, that culturally responsive pedagogy, that kind of ideal place of improving the learning and capacity of all students, of centering around those cognitive aspects that are going to fill kids' cups, fill teachers' cups, and building resilience and building that academic mindset by pushing back and giving kids the tools to do the pushing back against that hegemonic or dominant narrative, right? So these are different dimensions to equity. We have that multicultural surface level social harmony dimension, which is where a lot of systems kind of automatically go to originally, and then maybe have a little more hesitation or challenge with moving up into those other dimensions, right? Like the social justice dimension that develops individual critical consciousness, or the culturally responsive pedagogy dimension where that independent learning happens. And so I just walk through these three dimensions, but I want to pose them as, I think the right answer is they are both a spectrum and a pyramid, right? It's a both and, because they do build, right, from left to right. At the same time, they are all equally, they all need to be present at all times. So I leave you with this framework as a framework from which to jump off and consider the next part of this session. If we go forward one more slide, Susie and Ben and I developed this Google document that you can access by using that link right there. And Vanessa, Cynthia, Susie, Ben, somebody will drop that link in the chat box as well for you. And if you put that link in your browser, you will see the chart that we just reviewed right now, as well as a series of reflection questions that will help you operationalize what Susie is about to model for you. So this is where I will stop talking. Thank you so much for the opportunity, for the gift of your time, for trusting us with this part of your day. And thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Mariana. Gracias, Mariana. And, you know, I just thank you for framing this so beautifully. And participants, thank you for being here and for your time here. So, you know, as we go into this next section, because we're about to, you know, go and touch on to some of the ELPA standards and some of the achievement level descriptors. But really, before we even do that, as Mariana had mentioned, let's hold on. Let's think about our personal, can you hear me? Yep. Let's think about our personal and professional identity. Let's also go ahead and think about the ODE you know, equity lens, where it talks about the restructuring and dismantling of systems and institutions that create dichotomy of beneficiaries and of the oppressed and marginalized. So let's hold that, let's think about that as we go on and start to dive into this next piece. So Vanessa, if you could please switch slides. And what's important to keep in mind, when we're developing lessons, either in person or virtual lessons for emergent bilinguals, and as we think of that chart that Mariana shared with us, the dimensions of equity, let's take a step back for a second and let's ground ourselves also in these key areas, because this is really what would go into a lesson as well. And so we have the 4 ELPA domains, the reading, writing, speaking, and listening, have the 10 ELP standards, and that's hyperlinked there for you. And so the document there is a beautiful document. It's pretty substantial, and it's around 200 plus pages, but it has the Common Core ELA and math standards and the NGSS standards that you can link and crosswalk with the 10 ELP standards. But besides that, we have the achievement level descriptors, and that's also hyperlinked for you, because those are descriptions of tasks of what the students can do. And if for some reason you needed to find out your students' ELPA scores, you can always visit the On Track to English Language Proficiency page. And that's hyperlinked for that as well for you. But as you look at that, as you think about those standards, those achievement level descriptors, and as you hold space for the dimensions of equity that Mariana shared, here are a couple of other really key questions that we went ahead and we put into the Google Doc that we developed for you. And so Vanessa, I don't know if you can shift to that Google Doc, and if not, no worries. But if you could, that would be great. Yeah, and scroll a little bit down, because we put that there for you. And so some key considerations are like, what grade level is the student? What is the proficiency level of that ELP student? What ELPA domains did the students do well in, or what ELPA domains need support? What are those standards to really push as you push towards rigor? Always, pushing to the rigor. What are the achievement level descriptors? But here, as we continue to interweave all the equity pieces, is what dimensions of equity can my students experience through this lesson? What dimensions of equity are we prepared to provide, and where do we need support?
Hey, Susie.
Yes,
Sorry,
Vanessa.
before you move on, I've gotten a couple of messages from people that don't have access to the document. If you all click the second link that I put in the chat, it should prompt you to make a copy of the document, and that should allow you to edit as you need to. So I just wanted to make sure everybody gets access to that.
Absolutely. And like Vanessa said and Mariana said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Vanessa's amazing, and I'm sure that she will help you to get access to whatever you need. So thank you, Vanessa. So that's a chart that we put together, and then on the bottom you can see, let's start to link that to the multicultural education pieces, to the social justice, and to the cultural responsive pedagogy. Vanessa, if you would be so kind to go to the next slide, please. In the PowerPoint. Thank you. Perfect. So what we did here was we went ahead and, let me minimize this. We went ahead and we took grade band 4 to 5 from the achievement level descriptors. We focused in on reading, and I'm going to key in on level 4 at this point, because you always want to push towards rigor, right? Always pushing to that level. And so let's look at that achievement level descriptor as you're thinking about your lesson. And you're going to look at, when reading grade appropriate text, the student at level 4 is working on determining the meaning of general academic and content specific words, phrases, and idiomatic expressions, identifying the main idea or theme, and explaining how it is supported by details, summarizing excerpts from a variety of text, reading and interpreting information from a graph to draw conclusions. So when you're keying in on that, let's go back to the chart from Soretta Hammond and ask yourselves, what dimensions of equity, you can go back up, Vanessa, to the chart if you want. There you go. What dimensions of equity would you like to, could we key in on at that point? Like, for example, we had grades 4 to 5 over there, but let's say you're teaching to grade 5 and you want to push towards, level 4. Let's look at that. Maybe considering a book like Bud Not Buddy or Sadako and the 1,000 Paper Cranes, you know, as you focus on multicultural education, focusing on celebrating diversity, how can you interweave that as you're pushing that achievement level descriptor, as you're pushing that standard? How can you interweave that celebrating diversity? How can you perhaps interweave centering around creating positive social interactions across differences? How could that be interwoven into the lesson? It's powerful, and it's really fun when you do that. And then let's just even take social justice, focusing on exposing social political contests that students experience. How could you interweave that into the lesson? And so that's the challenge and the fun part as you go ahead and you hold your personal and your professional identity, and as you also continue to key in on those dimensions of equity that we have from Zaretta Hammond. And so Vanessa, if you could just scroll down a little bit from that Google Doc right there, just so people can see it. Thank you. And so you have the chart on the top. So as you're developing your lessons, as you're keeping your achievement level descriptors, as you're keeping your student and your class as to how to move this, you have the chart up there. You have some key questions to guide you, which are hyperlinked to key resources for you. So you don't have to do the digging and the finding. We did that for you. And there's some questions there on the bottom that you can start to also interweave and put in. And so at this point, Vanessa, if you would be so kind to go back to the PowerPoint, please. Thank you. And so at this point, I'm just going to pause, and again, thank you for this part. And you have all the hyperlinks there for you to help you as you're developing lessons, as you're interweaving everything, and as you're continuing on your journey with equity. And so unless one of my colleagues wanted to say something else, at this time, we're going to go ahead and pivot to the next slide. Okay. And so now we're shifting a little bit. So now we're going from into the language use survey, and then we're about to, I'm about to hand it over to Ben, because I know everybody's probably been anxiously awaiting a lot of the ELPA information that he's about to share. But I just wanted to share with you around the language use survey. And so the Bridge Language Use Survey was developed with statewide voice and input to minimize the over-identifications of ELs. And so as we're thinking about going into this next year, at this time, both the Bridge Language Use Survey and the Legacy, which was the prior one that we were using prior to January 1st, 2020, are available on our Language Use Survey page. And a super short hyperlink is right there for you if you'd like to click on that and see it. But Vanessa, if you could take me to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so here's what the Bridge Language Use Survey looks like. We've talked about this in prior webinars, but in case you didn't join us, here's what was developed with statewide voice and input. And the red parts are just the rubric. That's how you would code it to see if the student needs to be to go to the ELPA screener or not, which Ben is about to talk about in a second. And then that's on page 1. And on page 2 is the United States Department of Education definition of an English learner. And so that was important to be able to put there so that everybody could see exactly what it's also grounded in. And so on that piece, we wanted to protect as much time as possible for Ben, because I know he has a lot to share and a lot to talk about regarding ELPA and multiple facets on that. So Ben, if you'd like to take it away.
All right. Hi, once again, my name is Ben Wolcott. I'm the ELPA specialist on the assessment team at ODE, and I'm going to go over a few assessment updates, recent and less recent maybe. So we'll just proceed systematically through. Vanessa, let's see what's on the next slide. Okay, so not too long ago, on July 28th, the governor gave an address, a press conference, where new metrics were announced for when it would be a good idea to deliver in-person instruction as opposed to distance learning, and their districts need to meet, or their counties need to meet certain metrics in order to be able to deliver instruction in person. So this created some potential confusion with when it is and is not permissible to deliver the ELPA screener in person. We recently updated our unique screening guidance, which went out over the DTC listserv and will appear in the AA update. I'm not sure if it was in time to make it in the last issue of the AA update. So you may have heard about this first from your DTCs. However, even though the language that I'm using here appears in the unique screening guidance, you should consider this language to be applicable to all in-person screenings, including new arrivers. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But the general rule here is that we are not requiring districts to disregard the governor's health and safety requirements. We want districts to abide by the governor's health and safety. So if in-person interactions are permissible, if your local area has met the metrics necessary so that in-person interactions are safe on your school campus or between staff and students, then in-person screening is also permissible and safe. If in-person interactions are not permissible, and I'm using the language here of the school's reopening plan, but that plan is going to be informed by the governor's metrics and the health and safety regulations statewide. If in-person interactions are not permissible, then you should delay in-person screening until such a time as in-person interactions are permissible. Now, most of the time, in-person interactions is going to be synonymous with in-person instruction, but that's not always true. For example, there may be special cases like virtual charter schools where instruction will be delivered remotely, but in-person interactions with school staff are still permitted. So that's why we haven't gone so far as to say that if you're holding school on campus, then screen, and if not, then don't screen, because it's not quite the same thing. This next slide, I believe, is related to this first slide. So it's possible that in-person interactions may be, there may be a higher level of detail in your reopening plan. For example, statewide, the metrics or the requirement for distance learning for younger grades is different than for older grades. And likewise, you may know that a certain individual student in your school has family members or household members that belong to a high-risk group, and that asking this student to come in and screen may be placing a number of individuals at higher risk than another student with no household members in a high-risk group. So there is room for districts to make proper health and safety choices based on information that they have about their community. So hopefully your reopening plan has something to say about that. Let's see the next slide here. Okay, so for standard screening, as with every other kind of in-person screening, health and safety are the highest priority. Districts have asked about the federal timelines that are usually in place, the 30 days from the first day of school and the 14 days from the after the first day of school. Our most recent communication from the U.S. Department of Education, which was a May 18th fact sheet that is linked later in this presentation, confirmed that in a COVID impacted environment, those timelines are still in place. So the natural question on the part of districts is if we're going to, sorry, Vanessa, I meant like the next question. The natural question on the part of districts is if we're delivering distance learning for more than 30 days, then how are we going to meet this timeline? And I will address that in a future slide on remote identification. Go ahead and advance the slide. Unique screening is similar to standard screening in that health and safety are the highest priority. Your district may have their distance learning timeline already set, and I've heard some districts say, for example, we are going to reconvene in-person instruction. We're going to resume in-person interactions partway through November, and the unique screening window only lasts until November 20th. So there's no way that we can screen all of the eligible students before the expiry of the window. Our unique screening update specifies that the expectation from districts is to make a good faith effort to screen the students according to the priority criteria that the district has developed. So it may be that in your district, the majority of students who did not test on the ELPA summative last spring were at the secondary level, and you want to prioritize students who your data show were close to proficiency so that you can maximize their access to expanded course taking and to a wider range of elective choices. Likewise, you might have students who arrived very close to the summative last year and had no prior exposure to English. So your academic observations indicate that these students would very likely have not scored proficient on the summative, and that a unique screening would likely just pose an extra testing burden for these students and be unlikely to result in proficiency. And so you might assign those students a lower priority for unique screening. But those criteria are locally developed. ODE is not determining criteria for districts. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. So remotely identifying students is a big question in this environment where in-person interactions are not happening in a lot of districts. There was guidance on remote identification issued during the spring of 2020. That guidance, since it's the most recent, is the guidance that's still in effect, but we realize that this is becoming somewhat aged, and that we really need to update this guidance for a different environment, as the number of newly enrolling students at the end of spring is significantly different than the number of newly enrolling students at the beginning of a school year, and they are distributed differently across the grade bands. So we will be updating this remote identification guidance for 2020-21 school year. I do not yet have a firm date on when that guidance will be issued. But if districts are operating in good faith under the most recent guidance that's linked in this slide, then I feel confident that adjustments for students who are identified under that previous guidance will be small, and that it will not be highly onerous for districts. So I know the screener opened today, and some districts are facing choices about, do I screen or do I wait for this new remote identification guidance to come out? Or rather, do I identify according to this previous remote identification guidance, or do I wait for the update? The 30-day clock doesn't start ticking until the first day of school, so there is room to wait for a bit. But if circumstances compel you to identify students according to this most recent remote identification guidance, then my my feeling is that you won't have a lot of adjustment to do. I see somebody's portrait was momentarily illuminated like they had a question. At the rate we're going, I believe we will have a few minutes to spare for questions at the end of the presentation. So may I ask you please to write your question down or submit it in the chat, and just to make sure we get through all the content. I do believe we'll have a few minutes to answer a few things. So let's see the next slide. A few districts have asked me about non-traditional testing environments. Like what if we have a way to test students that abides by health and safety recommendations, but doesn't happen in our traditional testing room on our school grounds. So I've put links to the resources here that list the attributes that are needed to create a safe, secure, and distraction-free test environment. In addition to the resources that are linked here, you will want to, of course, consult the health and safety elements present in Ready Schools Safe Learners, and the supplementary guidance or the supplementary recommendations rather that are presented in guidance on administering the ALPA screener with physical distancing. And if you don't have those links, they're either in the slideshow or I can provide them in the chat as well. Okay, let's see the next slide. We're going through this at a pretty good clip, I think. Districts have asked me, what are the prospects of there ever being a remote screener? The answer is right now, a remote screener does not exist for the ALPA 21 screener. ALPA 21 signaled just over a couple weeks ago, that they were investigating the possibility of remote administration. They weren't able to give any more specific timeline than fall 2020. And I'm scheduled to receive an update on that during our governing board meeting in the coming week. So hopefully I'll get more information at that time. We do know that in order for a remote screener to really be viable, it would have to overcome some significant obstacles regarding test security and obtaining a valid and reliable result from the student. We're not, at this time, we're having a little trouble seeing how ALPA 21 can overcome all of those obstacles. But we do know that the existence of a remote screener would be very, very helpful for districts and would obviate a lot of the health and safety concerns that currently exist. So we're certainly willing to be convinced. Okay, let's see the next slide. Some districts are wondering about the ALPA summative, what it will look like, and at this point, at the rate of change that that COVID has had on the educational landscape, making any predictions about spring of 2021, I think would be highly dubious. So while we are planning as if the ALPA summative will occur as in prior years, we also know that it would be foolish to simply assume that COVID has no surprises left. So we're continuing to have conversations about what a 2021 summative can look like and what kind of alternative plans could be investigated in case of a COVID-related surprise. I feel like I'm getting close to the end of my slides. Let's see the next one. I'm very close to the end of my slides. So here we have contact information for ODE staff that you can and should reach out to for more information. I can see that we have covered our content with 17 minutes to spare, so we do have time to answer a few questions. And I see one in the chat right now from Friday Counts, which I think makes Thursday somewhat nervous and feeling inadequate, but let's see what this question is. Can you speak to how not testing for eligibility will impact LEP counts for districts? Will we still need to submit counts in the fall and spring? Will they just be identified as potential ELs? All of those questions will be answered in our forthcoming guidance on remote identification. Because all of the details have not yet been worked out, and because we do not yet have feedback from our data governance committee, I can't give firm answers to all those questions, but I can tell you that there will be a concrete answer one way or another to all of those. Okay, here's another question in the chat. Will there be more localized training for EL teachers later in August to help them prepare for comprehensive distance learning and how it applies to Title III
Yeah.
at the consortium level?
So
Susie, I'll hand it off to you.
thank you. Thank you. We're actually, thank you for your question, Lisa. That's excellent. We're actually in the process of looking and seeing what our visits are going to be like. They're going to more than likely be, of course, be virtual. So we're in the process of planning that as a federal systems team as we all look towards that. But I really appreciate your question, and we'll definitely keep that totally in mind as we visit. We're trying to see how that's going to be virtually, whether we do it at ESDs or how we do the process. So thank you. Just like Ben said, there's so much that is in. Yes, we're planning it, but it's not finalized yet. And please also know Ben has been working feverishly around those questions that came up earlier. And hopefully, we're just waiting for the Data Governors Board to give us some guidelines with that. Thank you. Back to Ben.
Thank you, Susie. Although I would say there was a whole half of this presentation that happened before I came online. So people should feel free to put questions, to ask questions that are intended for you or
Right.
for Mariana as well.
For Mariana, absolutely, absolutely.
Please do not feel confined to ELPA. It may be that people are typing in the chat and that they have a longer question, or it could be that our information was so complete that we have answered every possible variation of what people want to know about. So if we've 100% satisfied our audience, I'm not sure what else we could do at the time other than let people take a little break before their next session, if there is a next session.
Okay, we'll just do one last call for any questions that you might have. You can either put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we will have you unmute yourself and you can ask your question. We'll just give that a minute and see what we get.
Thank you, Kosa, for putting this together. I appreciate this. Thank you.
You bet. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Pandy. Thanks, Jennifer.
I'm sorry, but did you guys answer the question about localized training?
Yes.
Okay.
Just touched on it. Thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely. And of course, if you have any questions around Title III, please reach out to myself or Kim Miller. If you have any questions around Title 1C, a migrant, please reach out to me. And Ben is our amazing ELPA point for the state. So those questions go to him, So
I believe there's one more thank you slide that we could display to just make 100% use of the slideshow that we created.
Yeah, well, all right.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. You now have a break until 2:15. And if you're going to stay in this session, just mute yourself and turn off your video and then come back. And if you're looking for one of the other sessions, you can grab the link out of the Crowd Compass application. So thanks a lot to ODE folks. Appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, everybody. We really value and appreciate you. Thank you.